Good evening. I apologize for the minute's delay. We have a program here today to discuss a book written by my very esteemed friend Dr. Kunal Sarkar, The Sickness of Health. And on my right is Dr. Sarkar, the author. On my left, eminent neurosurgeon Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee. But before we set the ball rolling, may I request all of you to put your mobile phones on silent mode so that there is no disturbance because we are going live. And secondly, may I request all of you to watch out for the camera cables because we do not want a mishap while this program is going on. It gives me immense pleasure to thank the President of Calcutta Club, Dr. Partho Ghosh, for allowing this novel method of holding a meeting which is being broadcast live. And I would request Dr. Ghosh to please come forward and address us a few words. Please, Dr. Ghosh.
Good evening, friends. Good evening, friends. It is a great pleasure for the club to have Dr. Kunal Sarkar, Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee, and indeed also Mr. Pradeep Gupta, all very eminent and popular members of the club, to have a discussion on the latest book that he has written, The Sickness of Health, a vitally important topic for all human beings because our health is so important to us. I wish that we could organize a larger audience, but unfortunately the times are such that there are restrictions, and that is why we're going online. So without further ado, may I request Mr. Pradeep Gupta to start the program. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. With the permission of the two doctors, do we have a consensus to take off our masks when we are speaking at least?
Yes,
I don't mind. Thank you. Dr. Sarkar hardly needs an introduction to the members of this club, or in fact to very few people in Kolkata. Not only is he a cardiac surgeon of great eminence, but in the recent turmoil we've been through, he's been one of the leaders of the team that has done a record number of procedures called ECMO, is that right? ECMO, which has saved hundreds if not thousands of lives in the current epidemic. And then when I find that he's written a 430-word book, I marveled at how he ever got the time to get going on this. I know he's been at it for some time, but to complete this book in the current situation was indeed, I'm sure, a Herculean task. Which brings me to the first query I wish to raise before him. Kunal, why now? Was the timing entirely fortuitous, or was it something that you'd been planning and then you got caught up in the circumstances?
Well, Pradeep, first of all, thanks to you, Shundeep, and Shundeep is one of the very crucial contributors to the project, because what I have rambled through in the book is primarily my reflections, my commentaries, my critiques, sometimes a little bit harsh, I admit, but there has been very significant inputs from 10 of my friends across the country, of which Shundeep is one of the most sort of pivotal ones from the city. And my friends from across the country have contributed their domain expertise, like Shundeep has written on neurosurgery. None other than Dr. M.R. Girinath has a chapter on the evolution of cardiac work, and so on and so forth. We have one of the most esteemed people from CMC Vellore, who's given the insider's view of how CMC Vellore came into being and so forth. Actually, what's been happening is over 2018 and 2019, I went on giving a lot of talks to do with healthcare management, history of healthcare, the various deficiencies of healthcare. And I thought that, time has come to put a little bit of my reflections on paper. It went on, and one of the fewest times that I have to be grateful to the pandemic, that ever since 24th of March, people like me and Shundeep had a fair bit of time in hand, and therein started putting pen to paper and compiling this book, I wasn't at all confident that it will come up to this length, and that is why I still think that the combination of commentaries and contributions will probably make it a little bit more worthwhile. And I think I end with 3 chapters on the pandemic, where the chapters on the pandemic ends with the first wave. The vaccines were just about tiptoeing into the country. It hadn't till made its entry. So that is where the book on the pandemic, the book ends over there with the entry of vaccines into India. Perhaps the next edition will figure all the adventures we did with the second wave.
Thank you, Shandeep. We certainly look forward to that, because tracking the state of public health and private health after the vaccination, because it's something that we are not familiar with the situation that is existing at present. Now, I want to ask both of you, you're doctors of such eminence, and aren't you too close to the fire to write anything? I mean, whatever you write may either be misunderstood or may be construed as excessively pleasing to some people. Aren't you too close to the fire to be writing such stuff?
Yes, we are. Without a doubt, we are. There is no way pretending that we are not in the we are not just close to the fire. We're in the middle of a fireplace. But there's another way of looking at it. We recorded a discussion with few young doctors the other day. So we were saying that you have these series of films called The Night in the Zoo, The Night in the Museum. So we are like the animals in a zoo, a very peculiar zoo. And we are just trying to see the zoo from the outside. It's got its tremendous necessity. It is absolutely imperative for society. It's got its own peculiarities. And the trouble is, society at large only interacts with this facility on a need to use basis. So you don't want really to come close to healthcare. It's best avoided. Nobody wants to do it. But in these times, when we have been swept by this crisis of enormous proportions, I don't think anybody could ever avoid it. And I think therein comes the necessity of us becoming a little bit more familiar, as we do with politics, as we do with economics, as we do with entertainment. So I think this has been a little effort to make people familiar with the realities, the trials and tribulations of healthcare. I don't know how Shandeep looks at it.
Yeah, I was actually going to start rather by getting into the first chapter of Kunal's book. And I quite was entertained by his entitling this chapter, The Case of the Great Crasher, where you talk about yourself returning after training in cardiac surgery and one of your teachers turning around and telling you that you're a Bengali, you're fair complexioned. This is a bit I found a bit intriguing. So you need to go to the south and to Vellore or Chennai if you want to practice cardiac surgery. And also it's mentioned you don't come from a medical lineage, which may be a little obtuse observation about people like myself. But I just tell you that when I came back, well, before I went, when I met one of the professors of surgery who was actually your boss in surgery when you were a trainee, and I said to him, I want to do neurosurgery, his first reaction was, 50 বছর বয়সের মধ্যে বউ পালিয়ে যাবে, বাচ্চাগুলো না খেতে পেয়ে মরবে, 55 বছর বয়সের মধ্যে তুমি নিজেই সুইসাইড করবে.
Have
this
you
is
told
exactly his reaction.
Have you told Uttara this?
No, I told him when I met him after coming back, and when I reached the age of 50, that I'm still alive. I have still children who are fed well, and my wife hasn't left me yet, though she could any day. But I ask you this question because this gatecrasher theme is very interesting. So did you ever feel yourself as a gatecrasher afterwards, or when you?
Yeah, I did. I frankly did, because I come from a background. I just briefly. My father, who hails from Chittagong, he's a very hot-blooded man. Who, at the age of 15, he would have perhaps given Savarkar company in the cellular jail, because he was underage. He was stuck in Theravadi prison. Then he crosses the border, he comes here, and then we had a very, kind of industrial, technocratic lineage. If I have to be very grateful, I think I am. Like I'm grateful to the virus for giving me the time to write the book, I'm extremely grateful to the destructive left-wing communism, the left-wing trade unionism, which really played the theater of the tragic theater of industrial destruction of Bengal in front of my eyes. And I was hardly 11, 12 years of age then. And I had just made up one thing in my mind, that I am not going to step into this sort of world of nuts and bolts and factories and manufacturing ever again. I literally avoided my family. My family had no clue that I was studying biology. I studied an extra subject. I got into both IIT and medicine, and I was almost an outcast from my house when I said that, look, I'm not going into IIT, I'm going into medicine. My brother almost didn't speak to me for a week for saying this. But I definitely had this phobia, and when I really walked into medical college, which I enjoyed it its own way when I write about medical college over here, I was really walking into a very alien world. I had never really seen a doctor from any threatening distance. And I was probably getting into this world because I wanted to avoid the other. There was a definite fear psychosis in my mind because I had seen the tragedy enact in front of my eyes, which almost ended with my father passing away at a very early age. So yes, in some ways, but I'll just go back, because this thing that you said about neurosurgery and cardiac surgery being separated by all of 1 year, I still remember there was a lot of cynicism in our batch that two people from medical college, sniffing distance of one another, both appearing equally mad, one going into cardiac, one going into neuro. But Shundip, I think that was very important. You know why? Because that is one of the points I make over here. Because look at the human development, look at the technocratic standard of India, look at where we are in education, look at where we are in manufacturing, where we are in software. We are a very kind of lower middle class kind of nation. We should have never been a country which does complex neuro work, cardiac work, transplant work. Why are we any different from a Bangladesh or a Pakistan today? We should not have been. We are falling behind in GDP, we are falling behind in HDI, but at the same time we are a healthcare destination. Can you imagine the entire Middle East and Central Asia, countries with 3 times our per capita GDP, who comes to India for healthcare? This is an anachronism. And this precocious development of healthcare in India happened, Shundip, because there was a generation of people just before you and me, like I illustrate the story of K.M. Cherian. So 1970s was that watershed line in medicine that a lot of people who went abroad, those days there were less, there were less embargoes and stuff. So people like the likes of K.M. Cherian, like Professor Shubhi Chatterjee in your time, your father, a pioneer of pediatric surgery. So these people had gone abroad, got training, come back, work, and not only made a name for themselves, but started a lineage and legacy of training. And they gave us the expertise, which gave people like you and me a glimmer of hope that even we can do it. We can try and do something which was out of the set piece play. Because, and this replicated, we were far behind, CMC Vellore was doing it a decade earlier. Madras Medical College was doing it a decade earlier. There was Stanley John, the likes of the other pioneers. And this is very distinguishing. Jet technology is 100 years of age. Today, when you want to buy a passenger aircraft, you've got to fall in the feet of Boeing and Airbus. This entire country doesn't manufacture a passenger aircraft. To buy Rafale, let's see, what Frank Whittle developed jet engine 110 years back. So where are we in manufacturing? Where are we in software? Absolutely kind of middle grade expertise doing the dog's body work for the so-called multinationals. But medicine stands out because, and it was the defining decade of the late 70s to mid 80s that defined the decade, because that somehow it coincided with the entry of healthcare corporates. That the corporates, we take the mickey out of them, but people like Pratap Reddy, he recognized the opportunity. He said, look, I have a big market in front of me because India has a reluctant middle class. So in the Soviet-style economic era, we had a growth of a reluctant middle class, which had the healthcare need. You only had the very sort of mediocre nursing homes and things working, but we did at that time, we had a cohort of people who could give us this technical excellence. And these people got their opportunities in some non-corporate institutes like CMC Vellore, Railway Hospital, Perambur. A little bit, the Eastern India was still a kind of sleeping Rip Van Winkle. It took another decade to wake up. But that is very important, because that is why today in India you see something you don't see anywhere in the world. Nowhere in the world do you see that you give technology and expertise to people, to countries who are 5 times your sort of per capita GDP, 3 times your human development index. That doesn't happen in medicine is the only exception.
Absolutely correct. I mean, is that why your book has this unique format of, it's like a hybrid format. You've recognized excellence at AIIMS, for example, at the Christian Medical College, Vellore, Sandeep's own work in neurosurgery. So by introducing this hybrid model in a book, and that's actually what makes this book so interesting, made it interesting for me to read as well, that he's recognized islands of excellence all over India. And he's got the actual
Pradeep, I'll tell you something which Sandeep must recall in his own words. I think I'm not exaggerating if I said that, in those days, let's talk about 75, in the mid 70s and all, people were still doing stuff like pacemakers, closed mitral surgery, etc. But you mention anything to do with the brain, people were simply running away, isn't it?
Yeah.
We had a great avoidance for neuro work. So Sandeep, I approached him and I said that you recount for us that how on earth, you go to, I don't want to be demeaning to anybody, you go to the glitzy healthcare infrastructure, I've been there in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, etc., billion-dollar healthcare infrastructures. You look at the standard of work over there is absolutely petty, mediocre. And yet here, even in the back of beyond, even in Eastern India, even in Kolkata, you've got people like Sandeep and all doing complex pediatric neuro work, etc. So I think we need to hear from him, because I approached him straight away and said, you must tell your story.
You have a large number of academic and other papers. You've never written a book, so we'll wait for your book. But before that, you tell us why you got into this.
That's actually not correct. I have written books, but they are neurosurgery books.
Yes, exactly. You won't understand a sentence in that book, let me assure you. Please carry on.
No, I think what Kunal says is perfectly right. I think the impetus to do neurosurgery was a decision which a lot of people initially told me was mad, because for 2 reasons. As you rightly say, nobody wanted to do a very specialized subject at that time. It was perfect doing normal general medicine, doing gallbladder surgery, general surgery. I have nothing against it, but and nobody wanted to step out beyond that. And if you recall the neurosurgery that we were exposed to as medical students, you would really not trust your Labrador in a neurosurgical operating theater. But it was dreadful, to say the least. With all due respect to the people who were doing it, they had no facilities, they didn't know what was modern neurosurgery at that time. But really the impetus came from 2 people as far as I'm concerned. Because everybody assumed that I was going to do pediatric surgery.
I know. We did.
And everybody in medical college thought, yes, you thought. And, you know, it's very difficult to do something which your father has done. And the decision became even easier when one day my father said to me, and most people here would probably know that he's one of the doyens of pediatric surgery in this country. He said to me, there is not much new you can do in pediatric surgery. We've done it all. He always said we. He never uses the word I even at 95. He always says we. So he said, we've done it all. There's not much new you can do. Try and think of a subject where you can do something new. That was really one incentive. And the other was my own professor, Professor P.K. Mukherjee, who was then the Professor Director of Surgery in Medical College. When I told him, he was the only one who said, that's challenging.
The grandson of the great Ashutosh
Correct,
Mukherjee.
the grandson of the great Ashutosh Mukherjee. He said, that's correct. That's a subject which doesn't exist in Calcutta.
True.
But are you sure you want to take the risk? So there were these two factors. There was the taking the risk and the fact that you could do something that somebody else. So it was like treading the path that other people hadn't trod on. And I think you did the very same, because even cardiac, though was ahead of neurosurgery, again, if I can recall, and Kunal will remember this with some amount of humor, that every day when we came out of the surgery department, we saw lying outside a dead dog. And these were dogs on whom open bypass surgery was being practiced in the cardiac department of medical college.
True,
This was done formally, not like dialysis of dogs that have been done a few decades later in medical colleges, but this was done formally, and the government allowed dogs to have.
Actually, Shwandip, medical college in our time had the only approved animal lab.
Correct.
Yeah, which was more active than the operating
right.
theatre.
So we didn't see human beings having bypass. Every morning we came out and said, is the dog there or not? If he's not there, God, he's alive then after a bypass. And you'll remember that.
Yes, yes.
As an interloper from presidency, I confirm their story.
So it was a bit of everything. And I think we really looked at the world in very similar ways.
We did.
Yeah. Kunal, if we get beyond the book and get down into the themes, the most interesting theme, of course, in today's world is the relationship between medicine and media. So I often wonder whether it's a case of kiss and tell or whether it's a case of publish and be damned. How do you think, what sort of relationship should healthcare have with the media?
I think, we any professional domain right now in this day and age needs to be in kind of communication with the media. We have to be, because even the gurus who pretend to be sort of meditating in the heights of Himalayas, you will see they are the most media conscious people in the world today. So we have to be in touch with the media. And digital media has changed and disrupted everything and anything. So I don't think that, we can afford to be in isolation by any means. Look at the exposure of public health to medicine, to media today. Right? Even Shwandip would agree. Did we ever imagine we've studied public, preventive and social medicine in our medical college days? Could we ever imagine in our living times that preventive and social medicine will be a prime time topic for 1.5 years endlessly? Even some of us who ramble and babble about COVID and vaccines and this and that, we had to relearn and we had to update ourselves that we just can't be going around talking from perception. So yes, I think, relationship with the media is very required. But the question is, that don't try to be very sort of street smart. Trying to be street smart without substance is dangerous. That is where I would warn people, that you better know what you're talking about. You better know whom you're advising, because look, I think more and more communication is going to go into the digital media as we are doing this evening. So we better be sure of what we are speaking about. We better be sincere in what we are speaking about. But doctors, time and again, I must open this can of worms. have, I think, more often than not, we've been tried unfairly by the media, because you've had all these things about sort of ransacking of a hospital, medical negligence. I think the other day, it's only 3 days, I think some high priest from some oracle of Delhi just said there were no oxygen deaths in Delhi, you only had medical negligence. Yeah. So, you know, there are things like this where people will have to stand up, be there in front of media. Media has definitely been a great participant in awareness, in spreading the message to people. But at the same time, you know, we have lived through a few years where media was also, that this trial by instantly causes that, you know, medical negligence, too much of cost, and etc., etc. But I'm glad for once, you know, that I think there has been a lot more introspection, and the youngsters who come into medical reporting in media, I think they are a different kettle of fish than what used to be before. So it has definitely become a more considered domain right now.
Shandip, what would your outlook on this?
It's never a very good idea to add too much of one's feeling about the media with a media person chairing this conversation. But I would just say that I agree with Kunal that doctors need to be media conscious, but I think media needs to be conscious as well. You talk about, you know, in your book, chapter 35 of your book, you say that the relationship between the medics and the media is a little bit, or rather the media and doctors is a little bit like the relationship between the fire brigade and the fire. I think it's a little bit like relationship between your girlfriend and your wife.
Yeah.
Each one has a different perspective of the other, but they both seem to love the same person. And I think that's the relationship between medicine and the media as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's like the girlfriend and the wife. Each one wants to air their feelings about the other, but they like, it is sometimes best to maintain silence.
And if I may, Shandip, you know, I'll just allude to another section of the book where I've written about the toxicities of corporate healthcare. And that is married, you know, I'm really chancing my arm a lot when I write about the toxicities of corporate healthcare. Because as we said, you know, we've discussed the silver lining first, that India developed in terms of medical expertise. But perhaps the biggest oddity in India right now is, I cannot imagine healthcare being grotesquely advertised in India. You know, it's like advertising water in a desert. Whenever we put up a billboard, whenever we put up an advertisement about a hospital, about a facility, about, you know, doing something other, in the larger perspective, I think in this day and age, should hurt our conscience, that whenever we feel that corporate healthcare needs to advertise and shout at the top of the voice from the roof about what it is doing in a country where people are really picking up the pieces, you know, there is a scramble for healthcare in 70% of population, it makes you wonder what is happening. And because corporate healthcare is forced to exist in such an artificial cocoon, which is completely almost divorced from the rest of the country, because healthcare access is a big time problem, It is not until 2014 that healthcare became an electoral agenda in our country. There is no major democracy in the country who's ever had either number one issue or number two issue in a national campaign had to be healthcare. Whether you talk of United States, you talk about Obama, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. We've spent more than decades in United Kingdom. You know, healthcare, NHS in United Kingdom is like Babri Masjid times 10. You know, it's the issue of that significance. Australia, Canada, Malaysia, Singapore. I've been through the electoral campaigns of every civilized nation in the world. It's dominated by public healthcare. India took from 1947 to 2014 for the first time healthcare appeared in the national conscience. So because of which, you know, we've been feudally selfish. As long as my gallbladder got plucked out, my bypass got done, my cerebral hemorrhage got treated, I could not care a hoot what happened to the rest of the 130 crore people, because we got rid of the British, but we did not get rid of the colonial selfishness. Right. So therein, I think there is a kind of negatives and biases, again coming back to media and medicine, where it is viewed with a lot of suspicion. Because what is awareness and what is advertising? The difference, the line of difference is very, very thin.
Do you feel the same way?
I'll come back to advertising, but I'll just take Kunal up on another lovely comment he makes in his book when he talks about the history of medicine. And he talks about medieval times, and I've asked him this before, and he says that the healthcare facilities were meant for the rich sick or the sick rich.
Yeah.
And I always ask him, so what has changed from medieval times to today in India?
No, you see, what has changed is, if you look at the life expectancy, we have record of life expectancy of society, I think starting from about the 1600s. So from 17th century, you can go on recording the life expectancy in different era. Now, why did the ordinary person on the road, did they ever ask for health care? It was natural for them to die out of plague. It was natural for them to die out of cholera. And if an ordinary man on the road, a man in some sort of community dwelling, survived the plague and the cholera, he would probably be conscripted as somebody's soldiers. And by the time war was a very important factor of death. So from about 16th century way into industrial revolution, the world has not seen life expectancy beyond the 4th decade.
Absolutely.
Nobody's lived beyond 40 years
Beyond
of
the
age.
mid-30s or 40.
So, if you were 45, you were considered to be senile, So only the senators, the political elite would see the light of fifth decade shining on them. Women, why do you have the social trend of girls getting married at say 12, 13, 11, polygamy and stuff like that? Every society had it in their own way. Why? Because pregnancy and childbirth was considered to be a fatal disease in a woman. Pregnancy was not a physiological condition. 5 out of 10 women who were pregnant would definitely die. So the guy made sure that if wife number 3 died, he was young enough to have wife number 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever, so the lineage could continue. So there was so much of the world that was completely based on this life expectancy theory, and things actually turn around from the Industrial Revolution. It is really the Industrial Revolution, a little bit changed during the French Revolution, because French Revolution gave rise to hospitals. Because Napoleon carried a large army, and Napoleon actually one of the first people who had his own advisors in medicine. He had a surgeon who was so quick that he chopped off everything, including his assistant's hands and stuff like that. So from little bit from French Revolution and thereafter in Industrial Revolution.
Crimean War as well.
Yeah. So from the Industrial Revolution, you started respecting the common man. Why? Because he was important for your factory to run. The Germans, the Austro-Prussians and the Germans first recognized the value of the worker. Why was the worker important? If you had some spinning mill, some factory, something, you employed 100 people, he said, look, I have to have 100 fit workers working for me. So therein came on. Another thing came on is the concept of public health care policy. Every country in history had its moment to announce healthcare policy. When did today we sing praises of National Health Service? When did National Health Service come on? In 1946-47, when Britain was losing India. Can you imagine that a country is losing the diamond from the royal crown, and at that juncture of history, under pressure from the European communists and the British communists, Britain goes into National Health Service. Today, Government of India says, I cannot afford universal health. Why? I'm out of money. And Britain went into public health care when their coffers were empty post Second World War. Second World War has just ended.
The American debt. I mean, the
American
nation
debt,
was in debt
right.
several times over.
Right. When did Japan get into public health care? Japan went into public health care during the Meiji Restoration. So even when you had 1945 Hiroshima, when the two bombs goes up in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even in the height of Allied power, is being treated under public health care in Japan. Germany goes into public health care under Otto von Bismarck. But sadly, Pradeep, I don't know how you would see it, India's moment of social conscience nirvana hasn't seemed to have come yet.
That date is yet to come.
That date is yet to come. We are still undecided. We are still ambivalent. We still have 30 states with 35 healthcare policies. And that makes us wonder that after being born out of the bloodiest birth process a modern country has ever seen, if that has not shaken us, consider the current pandemic. You've had 30, you are a finance guy, you will know, you have 30,000 crores in 5 tranches or something as economic stimulus. How much of that come to healthcare? 4.3% or something.
Absolutely.
So even at that juncture, I wonder when will that moment come for India when we actually make a conscious decision that this is how I go out and treat and attend to the 130 crore people.
Absolutely. But this is a question I want to ask both of you. You worked extensively overseas and then you come back to India. But your book has a chapter on brain drain, which is very true. We lose our doctors overseas. And another chapter on medical tourism. So we have a situation where doctors are going abroad and settling there. And patients are traveling to India for treatment, a point that you made so forcefully earlier in this conversation. What made you defy the brain drain syndrome? And both of you. First, I want to hear.
I think Shondip takes it first.
Shondip.
No, you talk about what you've written in your book, and then I'll tell him about it.
No, I think, you know, part of the brain drain is very obvious. It is a person's yearning to have a good life. Let us be frank. I think 90% of all migrations are essentially economic. Migrations are either politically driven or economic, and we are living through an era right now where most of the technocratic migration is essentially economic, because medicine gave an opportunity to a lot of youngsters to get into, you know, sort of the American system, which is a huge system. The British, you see, they were very cunning, because the British needs about 8 or 9,000 doctors every year. They purposely underproduce doctors by 50%, because they know very well that they are going to have cheap human resources available from rest of the world. This year it didn't happen because of the pandemic. People didn't go out to Australia and North America, etc. So they had an oversupply of manpower in Britain. So generations have been used to it, you know. When did you have all these loads of Indian technocrats, engineers, etc. go to the US? When did that happen? Yeah, when did that happen? There was only one event that triggered it. And that one event was Yuri Gagarin going into space orbit. The moment Yuri Gagarin, you know Sputnik as a vaccine today, but the moment Russia puts out Sputnik in space and Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man to go out in space orbit, hell breaks loose in the intellectual world in the United States. United States says, I'm not having any more of this Russian nonsense, so they went hammer and tongs to import intellect from rest of the world. And similarly in medicine, like, you know, we had very insufficient infrastructure, overproducing doctors, so we were always a very sort of, you know, a rife ambience for people to think naturally. And we had this colonial connect for a long time, but then the passages starts becoming narrower. I think, you know, Shondip also has experience on both sides. So I think, you know, I think Shondip would perhaps agree. You remember in medical school, there is nothing against them at all. But I think at least probably 10% or maybe a little less of every medical batch knows from the very beginning that they are migrating somewhere, isn't it?
Yeah. I think the cause of migration is the search for food and water.
Yeah.
And it's because the grass looks greener on the other side. And if you look at the greatest migration that occurs on this planet, it's the migration of the wildebeests that occurs in eastern Africa, where millions of wildebeests every year cross the Mara River to go from Serengeti to Masai Mara. They go because they want food and they want water, and because the grass literally does look greener on the side of Masai Mara. But of course, every year, a lot of them get eaten by the alligators. I've personally videoed that. A lot of them get eaten by the lions. A lot of them do not manage to come back. Not everybody who goes to the other side settles in the grass which is greener. Some of them perish on the way or live a very average life. So you see, all migration, all sorts of brain drain occurs because you want better food and water. And so we emulate the wildebeests of Africa whenever we do this. You ask the question why people don't come back. I think the answer to that is if you look at the newspapers day before yesterday that Kunal alluded to, we have officially reports from our government saying that all the deaths that occurred in Gurgaon during the COVID, none of them was due to oxygen lack, none of them was due to infrastructure lack, all of them were due to medical negligence. So here's the scenario. We have an official record of somebody saying that this hospital could have to take 30 patients and do justice to them given the facilities they had. They took 40. So it's medical negligence. Now, if you have 30 patients, and unlike Kunal, I work in a very small hospital which had a very small COVID ward during the COVID times. But I've got a call at 1:30 a.m. in the morning by a patient of mine saying, my father's in the car, he's got an oxygen cylinder which is running out. You have no beds at the moment in your COVID ward, but I can't find a bed anywhere in the city. Can you please arrange a bed and take my father? He's in your car park and my oxygen cylinder is running out. So what do? Do you take that 40 patients when you've got the beds and the facilities for 30 and watch the other 10 dying in your car park?
Yeah.
In which case, again, you will be accused of medical negligence. Or do you take the 10 and try and do justice to them, and you will be, if they die, accused of medical negligence anyway.
Yeah,
so this is one reason why they don't want to come back.
So true. Since he raised this issue, which came about 4 days ago, I'll tell you something which has come up just yesterday. You know, it's very hot off the press. You've all heard about the OBC and the scheduled caste restrictions in medicine. Well, nothing against anybody. But just consider how funny the business of medicine is and why we refer to sickness of health, right? When I started writing the book, all my references told me that India produces about 74,000 medical graduates a year. By the time the book was finished, India was producing 90,000 medical graduates a year. So you have a medical college come up by every traffic light or wherever you, because it is electorally very, very profitable. And from some utter confusion which happened in 91 and 92, today we know everybody crying their hearts out. We have too many people, too few doctors. The Parliament of India discussed at length in 91 and 92, took a resolution that India produces more doctors than it needs, and hence 50% of medical education was shoved off to the private sector. Absolutely. Right? So that is the amount of intellectual dishonesty that prevails in medicine today. And anyone and everybody from every liquor baron, every toddy empire or whoever opened up a medical college wherever you wanted to.
Also politicians.
Also, absolutely. I mean, 80%
Sometimes aren't they the same?
80% of, there is a whole lot of political money parked in medical education today. So, consider this evening's situation. You have 90,000, around 90,000 medical seats. Half of them have been, government doesn't want to look at it, doesn't want to look at 45%, 45,000. You've only got 40,000 over here, and we are fiddling around with caste quota regulations over here, pretending, simply pretending that we are giving socially conscious opportunities to the country. And what is even more damaging is, for the last 8 years, India has a total inventory of something like 19 to 20 lakh hospital beds. The entire healthcare infrastructure of the country is completely static for the last decade. And what is happening is, we are producing more and more doctors. In a matter, it's about 15% increment in medical intake per year. The question remains that where are these youngsters going to work? Medicine is very privileged, because I've written that in my book. There is nothing called an unemployed doctor. An unemployed doctor is supposed to be in private practice. You can have an unemployed engineer, you can have an unemployed teacher, you can have an unemployed journalist, but you do not have, our species do not have unemployment. We can be scraping the bottom of the barrel and yet be considered to be in private employment. So this 15% year-on-year increment of doctors, where the hell are they going to get to work? So some of us have been crying hoarse and trying to tell the government that do increase your infrastructure in variance with the number of doctors whom you are producing. Who cares? No one. So it's really become a kind of a conveyor belt system, and I think we depend upon the wisdom of the economists to tell us that I think we are absolutely looking at functional, what do you call it, excess manpower in its eyes. It's like the pilots, you know. The pilots used to call the shots certain time, and then you had a gross overproduction of pilots, and they were completely considered to be at the mercy of the airlines. So in medicine, I think absolutely right now, in the present tense, in the current perspective, this tumultuous overproduction of doctors will shortly give rise to functional unemployment, because these youngsters, somebody who's done a post-graduation, say in surgery, in orthopedics, neurology, wherever, will that youngster be happy going to some primary health clinic, you know, wrapping bandages and putting Bernal on wounds? You want them to do that? And we are increasing postgraduate seats even faster without increasing infrastructure.
Yeah.
No, we live in a strange country.
I think in medicine, you'd agree, Kunal, at the present moment, and I say this whenever I go to schools or colleges that ask me to talk about medicine, the biggest problem in medicine today in India is that there is no place at the bottom or middle of the ladder. The only empty places are at the top of the ladder. So you either get there or you have no space.
No,
Very true.
because we have a situation here where if a private airport runs into losses, the government will cover the losses. If private healthcare runs into losses, evidently the government feels it should not be financed. You're supposed to manage your banks on your own. So it's a unique situation.
Yeah, even
but
worse,
you use
and
a lot of
Kunal refers to this, that if you look at the percentage of investment of the private sector versus the public sector in healthcare, it is 60%.
yes, absolutely.
And yet, if you look at decisions about healthcare that are taken, including the cost of a surgery, for example, the ratio is 99 to 1, if not 100 to 0. So this is the only particular specialty or profession in this country, as I call it, the island of leftism in a sea of right-wing capitalism, where you have a situation where the money will be provided by the private sector, the facilities will be provided by the private sector, but you in the public sector will decide how much it should cost and what they should do and what they should eat and how they should walk up the stairs, where the men's toilet should be. To everything is dictated.
Yeah, and
by
Shandip,
you. Don't you think
even
that's
at a
an
more
that doesn't exist in law, it doesn't exist in engineering, it doesn't exist in chartered accountancy or in business.
No, and the funniest thing is that we have intentionally kept medicine, health, in the state list, right? And there is a vague definition which says that certain sectors of healthcare are with the state government, whilst the central government goes on giving you directives from the top. Supposing you are spending today 100 rupees of state money, government money for healthcare, remember 70% of that comes from the state. 30% only comes from the center. And the rest of the entire expenditure people have to beg and borrow and out of pocket, right? And this is once again an area where we are intentionally undecided. You take the present vaccination program in India to be an example, right? Who on earth would give 30% of vaccines to the private sector? Why were they given to the private sector? Simply because you wanted to make the two companies happy. You were buying vaccines at some 150 rupees a shot and you wanted them to have 3 times the procurement price. So you said, I give 30% to the private sector who was paying some 700, 800 rupees. But what happened, Pradeep? Realize this. You missed the wood for the trees. You have 9 crore vaccines as a month, 10 crores in a monthly target. You gave 3.5 crore to the private sector, and there is no way the private sector can give 3 crore vaccine in a month. So who was suffering at the end of the day? At the end of the day, your vaccination target was suffering, and God bless us, come that fateful hour when we will be running around the streets with oxygen cylinders and people coughing and shivering all around us, then we will face up to this reality that why have we intentionally under-vaccinated our population. So this is a kind of willful willful neglect that is there in healthcare, that ever since I think last 7 years, central government has raised this issue repeatedly that health should go back on the concurrent list. I think it should, but nobody is belling the cat. Who's to do it? Am I to do it? Are you to do it? If for rational policy making, health has got to be in the concurrent list, so be it. It's not the people's fault. We cannot jerk up our forefathers from the Constituent Assembly and modify it. Whatever you need to do, for God's sake, go ahead and do it. Do it today. And then again, there is, as Shandip said, there is no domain respect in medicine at all. Once again, COVID is an example. Who is navigating India's COVID program? One pediatrician. When 8 out of the 10 leading epidemiologists in the world today are Indian, public health people. We depend on a biomedical person, a cardiologist and a pediatrician to navigate our COVID policies. And as he says, that 70% of the healthcare actually given is by the private sector. But when you have the decision making, private sector is not at all represented. You look at Germany. Germany is the most well provided for healthcare in the world. Government does not own a single hospital. Every hospital is a self-run trust. The government convenes a committee twice or thrice a year, and they decide on the insurance, the prices and policy. Germany does it, South Korea does it, Singapore does it to a certain extent. America has its mind of its own. But we are still completely undecided that are we, the center right now, the mood in the center and Niti Aayog right now is to go private with private-public partnership. Half the states of India, West Bengal being one of them, is on a socialistic spree. So who on earth is going to come and invest in healthcare when you have this kind of gross indecision? That's the problem.
So you use extremely strong statements in this book, and in one section on research, on academic, you use this phrase called academic apartheid, which Indian research often faces. When you submit a research paper overseas, you face this apartheid. Asian submissions, he says, are looked at with askance, and you have to prove yourself twice over to tell people that we know medicine also. So Shondeep, as a right person who's written extensively on research papers.
So you see, Kunal and I have spent 40 years debating mainly against each other. So I will
mainly against
actually, it's
presidency.
more than 40 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll take this opportunity to therefore differ from what he says in his book. And I know the point he's making when he says what you've just said about academic apartheid and the fact that US-led editorial boards rubbish Asian submissions, but being actually on the editorial board of a British neurosurgical journal as its associate editor, and also being an associate editor of an American neurosurgery journal and an Australian journal, apart from an Indian one, it would be very difficult for me to accept this concept of academic apartheid, particularly also being, unfortunately, and this is not to brag, but to just tell you a fact, also chairing the education committee of the World Society of Pediatric Neurosurgery now for my 4th year. It would be difficult for me to say that Americans look down upon Indians in medicine. And I have to say that it's actually been a revelation to me ever since I took over as chairman of the education committee of the International Society, how they are very keen in Europe and in America to ring us up. I mean, I've got a phone call from a very, very well-known, internationally famous neurosurgeon from Paris saying, I've got a child whose head I've opened and this looks a little strange. Could this be TB? Can you just look at your computer? I'm going to photograph this image. If you say it looks like TB because this child has come from Algeria and it could be something I don't see in France, could you tell me what it is? Then I'll decide about surgery. And I said, I'm driving. He said, well, drive somewhere where you can get a computer and get back to me. I'm in the hospital. And this is something I would never have conceived of 20 years ago. But I think medicine has become a much more level playing field today in academics than before.
Later on in the book, I do make a point that we have been very slipshod as far as our data keeping, our databases.
Absolutely.
I do make a point.
That, yes.
I do make a point that we all of us have operated caseloads by the buckets, thousands and so on and so forth. But in terms of our data keeping, scientific databases and data keeping, we have been pretty lackadaisical about it. Secondly is we have done a great disservice to ourselves because once again, with due apologies to our compatriots and seniors, most of the medical conferences are really kind of entertainment theme parks. The scientific content of major medical conferences till about recent times, I think it's improved a little bit. There was nobody kind of controlling or having a yardstick that what is the intensity of scientific content you want to see. So all in all, what has happened is the idea has gone on to the people, to globally, that Indians, there is abundance of experience, good surgeons, everything, but can you trust their data? Where did you see it last week? You saw it in COVID deaths. Is the world trusting our data? The world is not trusting our data, right? So yes, we have to carry the blame on ourselves, right? Two very good, the pandemic has been a huge example of how I don't know how many of you caught on the cheapest drug ever used in COVID, two of the cheapest drugs, antiparasitic, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine didn't really have well-structured study to support it. A lot of doctors went on taking hydroxychloroquine, but ivermectin had reasonably good data backing it, right? But even of the clinical experiences, ivermectin, the use of ivermectin originates in Bangladesh.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Very curious.
It didn't originate in India, it originates in Bangladesh. And the moment people got to hear that you are using a drug which is very popular in Bangladesh, it's almost you have fallen out of the sophisticated club of remdesivir and stuff. Remdesivir was a huge scandal. Our COVID task force was completely aware of the fact in October that remdesivir has very flat performance. But intentionally, the Indian guidelines did not mention this well into 7 months after that, because they allowed all the trafficking and black marketing of remdesivir to happen. The day when we get down putting pen to paper about, there is a lot of history of COVID to be written between the lines. So coming back to the thing we are saying is that yes, Shundeep is a very well acknowledged academician. I have been a part of the first randomized control study on cardiac surgery ever to come out of Asia. And I tell you, it was a jolly good study. It had 7 surgeons and 7 statisticians backing it up. But it was our experience from there that we are to blame for it. So I think the current generation, the current group of people who are working, hopefully, we haven't come out of the jungle yet, we cannot pretend that we have walked into civilization. I think from being in the middle of the jungle, we are probably in the peripheries a little bit, but still, our current generation, people like Shundeep, myself, will have to go on hammering to them that how important it is to do lots of clinical work, but have a good amount of scientific data, have good amount of scientific publication. Because with the exception of few very well acclaimed people like him, I tell you, there is tremendous skepticism about.
I really hope that the picture is revised, because I'm looking at your hospital.
Kunal, one of the problems were that our teachers never encourage us about keeping records.
No, we were very busy with mugging,
Yes. So, in fact, the only
Yeah,
reason why
medicine became a very rote subject.
Absolutely.
very
I'll be
rote
honest with you, the only reason why I probably have a record of every single patient I've seen from 1995, because I was computerized from then, was because I used to see my father for 50 years. Every patient he saw, he put a carbon paper and wrote the prescription, kept
Brilliant.
that carbon paper and filled up a computer card. And we had his office full of these thousands of computer cards where he himself sat all weekend and filled up the carbon paper copy of the patient he'd seen. And this was amazing, and this is what encouraged me to get hold of a computer.
We've
I
seen,
could never have done this.
yeah,
in my
we've seen very famous cardiac surgeons. The only data they were interested in was the income tax form,
Yes.
The income tax returns.
Well, you talked about corporate hospitals. I
Yeah.
was in a debate with some of the people in a corporate hospital, and this is exactly what I said. That the biggest problem I have against them is that the only audit that they're interested in is not medical audit of results of cardiac surgery. They're interested in how much money the cardiac
No,
surgeons get.
you miss out a point. Whenever you see, you go through the streets of Calcutta, there's something very interesting. It happens everywhere in India. You walk beside any pathological lab, any hospital, anything that has come up between 1970 to about 1980, 85, everybody is like Ma Kali Diagnostic and Research Center. Everybody. Every hospital is so and so hospital and a research center. Have you ever wondered why? Because if you had the research center mentioned over here, you could claim some tax exemption. But over the last 25 years, have anybody ever seen that has a grain of research ever happened in these places? No, right. So this is very similar to the disservice that is happening in the higher education sector in India today. There are a lot of cattle sheds which are passing on, masquerading as universities. So we had...
But I think you're being a little unfair, because reading your book, I got the feeling that Indian healthcare and the service rendered by doctors is actually a lot more cutting edge than what is done by your pharmaceutical industry, for example. We haven't produced a molecule in God knows how long. I mean, if we've ever produced one, ever since hydroxychloroquine perhaps. So isn't it true that the pharmaceutical sector is actually a big laggard when it comes to the total healthcare system? Because I mean, the sort of work that you guys have done in neurosurgery, in cardiac surgery, in treatment of COVID, ECMO and stuff like that.
No, you see, the story of pharmaceutical...
So you're being a little unfair to your
No. I'll tell you something very funny. You know, if you see something happening in front of your eyes every day, you accept that being given. The biggest corruption in India happens in front of your and my eyes, and we take it as a given in our lives. Who on earth needs 200 medicine shops lined up next to one another, each one selling exactly the same stuff and undercutting the other fellow? All of you who have some experience of walking down the streets in any semi-civilized country, just think of this. World's sixth economy, world's seventh economy. We are Atmanirbhar Bharat and the rest of it. Who on earth requires the same antibiotic to be sold successively from 200 shops, all opposite a government hospital? Most of them.
And all claiming to be fair.
And we pretend that the government hospital treatment is free. The government hospital cash counters are not in the government hospital, they are outside. That has been outsourced, right? So that is the mother of all corruptions in India, where we have completely allowed the thoughtless defranchising of our pharmaceutical products. So what happens is there is a great incentive for the pharmaceutical industry to be completely research-less, non-innovative. They are actually all glorified photocopiers. Because every molecule, today you think antihypertensive drug has come out, say in England or Japan or somewhere, you can manufacture the same drug in India in 7 days' time without paying a penny in intellectual royalty. Why? Because India does not recognize intellectual royalty on the drug. It recognizes intellectual property on the process of manufacture. So if you have manufactured something at, say, 65 degrees, I will file a plaint in court saying that I have actually manufactured the drug at 67 degrees, and that makes it a new drug.
That's my subject, I know that.
That's your subject. So that gives, that completely defies all intellectual property law in pharmaceuticals in India. And you know, this photocopying, this massive photocopying in the industry was so rampant. What happened was India about a decade ago was a good place for making the original, what you call it, the parent molecules. Absolutely. So when you were busy fighting the Chinese in Ladakh, remember, one of the biggest threats from the Chinese in Ladakh was not the few square kilometers of barren land. One of the biggest threats was that India would have been starved of paracetamol, because the entire paracetamol product came from China.
Absolutely.
Right. So if China wins today, your pharmaceutical industry will probably come to its knees, right? Because China, that India gave up its manufacturing of the mother molecules, and that entire industry was swallowed up by China, and we became the bootlegged photocopiers of the world. So next time you go on to, take a fight in Ladakh, please remember, have enough stock of
paracetamol first.
stock
That's a
up
tip from a
paracetamol
doctor,
first.
okay? Next time you fight China, stock up on paracetamol, stock up on ivermectin, stock up on anti-malarial drugs, so many other things. So Shondeep, tell me, you've been through the book extensively, you're one of the contributors. Neurosurgery, cardiac surgery, these islands of excellence can happen in India. We've heard about AIMS, the Christian Medical College, so many others. But why is it that these do not appear to be replicable? They don't appear to have, we don't appear to have a model where we have internationally replicable models, Indian hospitals overseas, which are beacons of hope in that country. So many patients come to us. Why don't we go and set up there? Is it something to do with our business environment? Is it something to do? I mean, both of them.
No, I don't think my reaction to that is, look, you see, medicine is still not driven by AI. Processes are important, Excel sheets are important, but at the end of the day, you will still need two idiots like you and myself and Shondeep to go and do the job. It's like we have Mr. Mitra there. It's like a good lawyer. So probably all his arguments can be logically paraphrased in artificial intelligence, but it will still need a very good lawyer to go up and make a robust presentation of the case. So I think medicine still has a defined human component to it that is very important. One case in example is, you look at Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, who opened up their billion-dollar facilities in the Middle East, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, etc., etc. They're all great Bollywood flops. Nothing happens over there. Their people still come to Mumbai, Delhi, and the rest of it for treatment. So there is still a human component. But coming to the next part of the question, yes, we are not lacking in talent numerically, but I don't think we have that depth of talent yet. Why don't we have that depth of talent? Because today India has about 10 lakh doctors, slightly less than 10 lakhs, right? Less than 20% of the 10 lakh people in medicine are in any kind of structured employment. 80% of India's doctors live from hand to mouth, right? If they're sick for 3 days, earnings gone, right? So, we are considered to be God. This is a God who is rather penniless, So, all these glamour stories here about medicine does not apply to 98% of the professional population. So, infrastructure and predictability has to come to the profession. If we do that, then we are going to have more talent nurtured. We are going to have more predictability in their professional lives. And I think situation will improve. But don't you go on telling people to set up shops here and there,
No,
because
your comment on this.
I see Mr. Joyanto Mitra sitting in the audience and smiling. I'll take a cue from him to answer your question. He smiles a lot more now than when he was Advocate General of West Bengal. He had a car with a flashing blue light, police, outriders and everything else. But he smiles more now. And you know the answer to the reason why? Autonomy. And I think that's the reason why doctors, you say, why are there no more centers of excellence? It's the one single word that I would use is autonomy. See, what happens to a doctor when he becomes a doctor? He has to work somewhere. And assuming he doesn't belong to the wildebeests that migrate across the Mara, he has to find a gainful place to earn a living in this country. What are his two major choices? He joins a government hospital or he joins a corporate hospital. And I say this with telling you that Kunal works in a corporate hospital, but he has complete autonomy in his own department for reasons that you may or may not know. So he's not one of the corporatized doctors that I'm going to refer to now. What happens if you join the government sector? Well, it depends whether you're the blue-eyed boy or the hated boy of the political party in power. And that doesn't depend on how many gold medals you got or how many publications you have, how brilliant a surgeon you are, how brilliant your results are. It depends how often you go to the cathedral of power in the political scenario in your city or state, which may be in Alibuddin Street or maybe in Kalighat or may oscillate between one and the other or go somewhere else. So your credentials, your ability to go up, your ability to function within the government sector as a doctor depends on how you please your political bosses. It does not matter on your surgical skill. It does not matter on your publications. It does not matter what respect you command in the country or the world in your specialty. And therefore, to remain in that position and to rise, your primary objective is to be subservient to a political master. Scientific research, achievement of academic or medical excellence naturally falls into second and third place. If, on the other hand, you opt to go join the corporate sector, fantastic, you get a lot of recognition, you might have a lot of your photograph in different Selval boards and newspapers from time to time. You get an opportunity to earn a lot of money. You may not get that many patients initially, but majority of the people who run corporate sector hospitals regards doctors as playing the same role in the hospital as the security guards. An unfortunate necessity, but one that can be dispensed with at any moment of time. And somebody who should ideally not have any individual recognition, but be recognized as a doctor in hospital X, like a security guard in hospital X. So where is your then incentive to go after scientific excellence? Again, your only incentive to rise is if you can generate enough funds. And that generation of funds can mean a compromise on your academic decision, your scientific spirit, or even, I dare say this publicly, your ethical standards. So these are your two options. And this is something that we have to realize. And this is the reason why, with very few exceptions, you do not have people pursuing.
So I think, Shandip, as you
and I may be cynical, but this is my
no,
viewpoint.
but you've been eloquently cynical or cynically eloquent, put it either way. But I think this drives us to the point that we really need a kind of matrix, a policy, a given statement.
Absolutely.
that is how healthcare is going to be dispensed to the people. Right.
A national policy.
A national
not
policy.
a state.
Right. So in the same way, the energy that we have in politics today, look at this, you can calculate the last 10 votes which happens in a booth, who has gone this way, etc. Today we are thirsty to know the Sero survey data from every district in West Bengal. I do not have that in front of me. Right. So whether it is in public healthcare or in healthcare policy, the raw political energy that India has shown in its 73 years, absolutely, without any reservation in the political domain, the political energy of India now has to be energized into the social sector, and medicine has to be one of the sectors. We definitely need a cogent policy between the center and the states. Healthcare cannot be left within two stools. And I think it has to be a demand from the civic society that we cannot be living this schizophrenic life day in and day out. We need to know this bipolarity that Shundip has just depicted in front of you. Why should we have this bipolarity? So let us have a system by which the 30 states, the 3 lakh square kilometers of this country, the 1.3 billion people can say that, look, we know the way we are going. You can have a GST, you can have a fiscal policy, you can have we are aiming for one country, one election, but we are not aiming for one country, one healthcare.
Absolutely. And Kunal, you will agree with me, I think the biggest evidence of how a lack of a nationally controlled health service can affect you is on both sides of the Atlantic. And for somebody like me who's worked on both sides of the Atlantic, there is no question today that the best in medicine in many ways is in the United States of America.
I think we leave it to the journalists.
Yeah, no, but you see, the point I'm making is the best today in various healthcare specialties may be in the United States of America. But the average healthcare in the United Kingdom is still way superior to the average healthcare in North America. Way superior.
No, you don't. You don't have to walk that far. Look at public health in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Look at public health in Bangladesh. Look at what's happening. Don't just go to Thailand for a massage. Look at their healthcare system. The whole of Southeast Asia put together had less fatalities in COVID than even the state of Kerala. Right. So look at the power which is manifesting at our doorstep. This is a social revolution in process. Why should we be left out of it?
Well, this book has been, has been such a great read, and I congratulate Kunal on this because it's deeply comforting in many ways. There are chapters which recount the excellence attained by the Indian healthcare sector in neurosurgery, in cardiac surgery, in other aspects of healthcare. And at the same time, so disturbing, the lack of a policy, the lack of any sort of original research when it comes to pharmaceuticals, the fact that the government would like not only to tread on your toes, but actually crush them into the ground so that you stay in line. So comforting and disturbing at the same time, well worth a read. Don't get intimidated by its 400 plus pages. And we look forward to the second edition of your book and Shundip, your first book. So till then, I think we've spent a lot of time and I thank you for your patience. We'll wind up this session and I hope you enjoyed. This recording will be made available to all members and I'm sure that you'll watch it at a later date as well. Thank you and good night. Stay safe and we're going to put back our masks again. I would advise you to do the same. Remember, switch on your mobiles now. You don't need to miss your call from home. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well done.